Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our slow waddle through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book, as opposed to doing it just, 15 minutes a shelf, like I might have thought of doing for my 2019 library tour. I left the Penguins until last, and I ran out of time, and I'm glad in a way that I did, because it gave me the idea to do these slowly. And that makes sense because these are my best friends. These are the books that are my best friends. I have spent more time with these books by far than with any other kind of book in my library or in my life. I've gone back to these authors, most of them, so many times, so many times, just for the fun of it, or to study them, or at a new angle, and I come away refreshed. I really do. I don't know if you'd be the same in your reading habits, but I come away from these things refreshed. This is not just a collecting fetish for me at all. These books are my best friends. And we've moved away from the classical world. We haven't moved away from Latin. Most of the books Latin remained the international intellectual language of Bellatra for a long time. So we're still dealing with a kind of Latin. Latin itself is changing. Languages are living things. So medieval Latin is a nightmare. It is a nightmare. Compared to classical Latin, it's a nightmare. I have plumbed the depths of medieval Latin, and I can speak from experience. And when I was plumbing the depths of medieval Latin, I had an old friend who wrote a book I think you've probably heard of, and he used to maintain at our monthly lunches, adamantly, that I was a medievalist. He used to say over and over again, you talk all the time about the ancient Romans. Sure, you love writing about them, and you wrote that novel, but you're a medievalist. They're the ones, when I see the look in your eye, the light in your eye when you talk about them, and it's different than when you talk about the Romans or anybody else. That feels like sacrilege, of course, considering how much time I have spent in ancient Rome. But nevertheless, we are now in what is usually referred to as the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, so to speak. And specifically today, we're at AD 1130, AD 1140, AD 1150, somewhere in there, when this author, who was probably a Breton, he was probably, there was a colony of sort of non-Welsh people right on the Welsh border. And he was probably from there. It certainly seems that way from his writing. And he wrote a book. This is Geoffrey of Monmouth. Hence, even he, in his own lifetime, used the sobriquet of Monmouth to sort of harken back to Wales. He also used another sobriquet in his writing life and was often better known by that, which is Geoffrey Arthur. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, I think, is because the number one takeaway from this book, The History of the Kings of Britain, again, this is not the whole thing. This Penguin Classic could be bigger. But the number one takeaway that most people have got from this book is the length of time that Geoffrey of Monmouth spends on King Arthur. This is the first really fleshed out narrative of King Arthur, as opposed to bits and pieces or fragments that we have. And it's pretty impressionistic. It's pretty entertaining. A lot of Arthurian pastiche novelists have gone straight back to Geoffrey of Monmouth for their material. The story is the Kings of Britain, starting with Brutus, which was also that was sort of a folkloric story. There was a long poem called Brut. There was the same thing. The idea that the Kings of Britain were seeded by from Roman mythology. It's a typical thing. The Romans did it themselves. And Geoffrey starts there and moves his story on through one great story about kings and princesses and wars after another. And like we saw with Gregory of Tours, that is a very promising spine to organize a book around. It's much more promising than what we saw in, for instance, Bishop Eusebius, where your moral histories tend to be less entertaining than this kind of swords and battlefields history, even though these authors in these times, in the 1130s, were certainly pursuing a moral agenda. They certainly were doing that. I don't want to say that these were secular writers. They weren't. This is yet another churchman. We've had a string of them so far. Geoffrey was also a bishop at one point in his life. Probably a lot less ecclesiastically inclined than either Bede or Gregory of Tours, but still, It was just the power structure for the writing, the copying, the researching. It was natural. And this is by Lewis Thorpe, this translation, same guy that we saw before, and his translation here is really good, very swashbuckly, very blood and guts, and you get a lot of that in this book. I was tempted for the reading excerpt that I usually give you to just read about King Arthur, but I'd rather read you something else to give you a sense of what Geoffrey does. And it's a bit of a long excerpt. It won't take long to read, I don't imagine. But it's just a war. When we're going to an interesting part in the book, we will of course go to the Beagle. We will go to the bookmark that is a Beagle, and this is an invasion that almost certainly didn't happen. So you have to keep in mind when we talk about a history of the kings of Britain, that Geoffrey of Monmouth is not. He's not reliable in the sense that we would understand historiography today. So. You have to ask yourself meta questions when you're talking about him. You have to ask yourself, why is he writing this, and what tradition is he drawing on, rather than, so he says this happened, I guess that means it did, or anything like that. But let's see here. So we're talking about a corrupt king whose name is Ceredic. And when the Saxons came to understand his fickleness, they sent to Ireland for Gormund, king of the Africans. It's a long story. If you're wondering why they went to Ireland for the king of the Africans, it's a long story. Who had gone there with an enormous fleet and conquered the people of that country. As a result of this treachery by the Saxons, Gormund, accompanied by 160,000 Africans, came over to Britain, which, between them, the Saxons and the local inhabitants were completely devastating. The former by breaking their oath of fealty, the latter by continually waging civil war amongst themselves. You can tell this outrages Geoffrey, and he's going to let you have it straight in the face with that outrage later on. Gormund made a treaty with the Saxons and then attacked King Ceredic. After a long series of battles, he drove the king from city to city and then forced him to take refuge in Cirencester, where he besieged him. Isambard, the nephew of Louis, king of the Franks, went to join him there and made a treaty of friendship with him. The terms of the treaty were that, as a token of his friendship for Gormund, Isambard should renounce his Christian faith. This on the understanding that with the latter's help he could wrest the kingdom of Gaul from his uncle, by whom, he so alleged, he had been forcibly and unjustly expelled. The city I have mentioned was captured and burnt. Gormund then fought Ceredic and chased him over the Severn into Wales. Next, he ravaged the fields, set fire to all the neighboring cities, and gave free vent to his fury until he had burnt almost all the land in the island, from one sea to another. All the settlements were smashed to the ground with a great force of battering rams. All the inhabitants were destroyed by flashing swords and crackling flames, and the priests of their church among them. Those left alive fled, shattered by these dreadful disasters, but wherever they went, no havens of safety remained open to them in their flight. You foolish people, weighed down by the sheer burden of your own monstrous crimes, never happy but when you are fighting one another. Why have you so far weakened yourselves in domestic upsets that you, who need to submit far distant kingdoms to your own authority, are now like some fruitful vineyard which has gone sour, and you cannot protect your own country, wives and children, from your enemies? Keep on with your civil squabbling and forget what the Gospels say. Quote, every kingdom divided against itself shall be brought to desolation, and a house divided against itself shall fall. Because your kingdom was divided against itself, because the lunacy of civil war and the cloud of jealousy obscured your mind, because of your pride did not permit you to obey a single king, that is why you see your fatherland ravaged by the most impious heathens, and your homesteads overturned one upon another, all of which things those who came after you will lament in the future. They will see the cubs of the wild lioness occupy your castles, cities, and other possessions. In their misery they will be driven forth from all these. Only with the greatest difficulty will they ever recover the glory of their former estate, if they ever recover it at all. There's even Lewis Thorpe, a phlegmatic Brit, puts an exclamation point at the end of that, because that is what Geoffrey is like. He'll be going along about this and that foundation and this and that canal, and then all of a sudden he will let fly. and it's enjoyable. It's hugely enjoyable to read. So this is another Penguin Classic recommend for you. Takes a bit of getting used to, but not nearly as much as, for instance, Eusebius. So and it comes a little closer to home for a lot of readers. I mean, the history of the Franks is equally open-ended at the beginning. It's equally grandiose in its design, but it's mostly dealing with rulers and places and place names that will be a little strange. Whereas Geoffrey is getting you closer to a world you may know, to a world you may live in, a world you may have visited on your last vacation. So History of the Kings of Britain definitely gets a recommend. I could do with a new translation, an entirely new translation of this work, with an interesting cover as opposed to a boring cover. For instance, a nice high-definition color portrait of the Severn right there at the border of Wales would be wonderful for a big trade paperback of this. With a new translation, tons of new notes, incorporate all of Lewis Thorpe's scholarship and notes, but everybody else's as well, especially everybody later. That would be wonderful. I certainly call on Penguin Classics to do that, and they're not going to. They've moved in a totally different direction. But if you find a copy of this, or if you have one and it's been moldering on your shelf, I recommend it. Geoffrey is a very energetic writer. So with that, I'm gonna wrap up this Penguin Classic for today. Once again, my standard warning on the weekends: so there may not be a Daily Penguin tomorrow. So don't panic if there isn't one, but I will do my best. So I will maybe see you then, certainly on Monday. So thank you, BookTube.